Insignificant. That was the last word Leah spat at Gideon before the hospital's automatic doors hissed shut, leaving him in the fluorescent hum of the NICU with a 3-pound infant and a heart that had just been hollowed out. Welcome to the channel. We often think we know the people we love until the moment the ground falls away. Gideon was a man who gave everything to a woman who saw him as a temporary stepping stone. But life has a way of balancing the scales. Stick around, because the man Gideon becomes 8 years after that cold hospital night is someone Leah never expected to see again. If you're a fan of seeing the underdog take his life back, hit that subscribe button and let us know in the comments where you're watching from today. Nonetheless, the weight of the silence in the hospital room was heavier than the child in Gideon's arms. The fluorescent tubes overhead buzzed with that particular frequency that drilled into the base of the skull. Gideon stood in the exact center of the NICU hallway, still holding the discharge papers that smelled faintly of cheap printer toner. His daughter, Rosie, he'd named her after his grandmother, lay in a portable incubator on wheels, her chest rising and falling with the mechanical assistance of tubes that snaked into her nostrils. The nurse with the tired eyes and coffee-stained scrubs had asked him 3 times if someone was coming to pick them up. Gideon had nodded each time, the lie tasting like copper pennies on his tongue, and nobody was coming. Leah had walked out 47 minutes ago. He'd counted every single one of them on the wall clock that ticked too loudly above the hand sanitizer dispenser. The thing about abandonment is that it happens in layers, like the slow peel of skin after a bad sunburn. First, there was the shock. The moment when Leah's Prada handbag, the one he'd taken out a credit advance to buy for her birthday, had swung around as she pivoted toward the exit. Then came the denial, where Gideon's feet had carried him 6 steps after her, before a nurse gently grabbed his elbow. Now, standing in the hallway, with a premature infant and a hospital bill that read like a phone number, came the hollow understanding that he was alone, truly, catastrophically alone. The discharge papers listed a sum of $47,000, with $312. The insurance Leah had insisted they didn't need because her modeling contracts were about to explode, she'd said, would have covered 80% of it. But there was no insurance, just Gideon, a minimum wage position at a warehouse distribution center, and a baby who needed specialized formula that cost $60 per canister. His phone buzzed. A text from Leah's number. "Changed my locks. Your stuff's in the dumpster behind the building. Don't contact me again." The phone screen cracked when it hit the linoleum. Gideon stared at the spiderweb fracture spreading across Leah's contact photo, a selfie she'd taken at some gallery opening where she'd worn a dress that cost more than his monthly rent. In the photo, she was laughing, her head thrown back, champagne glass catching the light. Gideon couldn't remember the last time she'd laughed like that around him. Maybe she never had. "Mr. Carver?" The nurse was back, clipboard in hand. Her name tag read Deborah. "We need to discuss the payment plan options." Payment plan options? The phrase hung in the recycled hospital air like a noose. Gideon followed Deborah into a small office that reeked of stale coffee and the particular desperation of people trying to negotiate their way out of medical debt. The chairs were plastic, molded to fit nobody's body comfortably. A poster on the wall showed a mother cradling a healthy, full-term baby with the caption, "Every child deserves a healthy start." Rosie deserved better than this, better than a father who had to ask for payment plan options, and better than being born 3 months early because Leah had refused to stop attending parties where she'd stayed out until 4 in the morning, drinking cocktails that glowed under black light and dancing in heels that could puncture vinyl flooring. Deborah's voice became background noise as she explained terms like minimum monthly payments and income-based assistance programs. Gideon nodded at appropriate intervals, but his mind was stuck on the image of his belongings in a dumpster, the guitar his father had given him before the cancer took him, the collection of vintage science fiction paperbacks he'd been accumulating since he was 12, photographs from his childhood, irreplaceable memories now probably soaking in someone's thrown-away Chinese takeout. "Mr. Carver, are you following?" Gideon blinked. Deborah was staring at him with an expression somewhere between sympathy and impatience. "Yes, sorry. What was the monthly amount again?" $487 for the next 8 years, assuming no interest accrual beyond the base rate. But that's only if you can provide proof of income below the threshold. $487. His rent was $650. Utilities ran another $120 in winter when the building's heating system wheezed like an asthmatic chain smoker. Food, transportation, baby supplies, the mathematics of survival suddenly resembled a Rubik's Cube designed by a sadist. "I'll make it work," Gideon heard himself say. The words came from somewhere outside his body, from the person he needed to become now that the person he'd been. Optimistic, trusting, foolishly in love, had been cremated in the last hour. Deborah handed him a stack of forms. "Fill these out and bring them back within 7 business days. And Mr. Carver, there are resources, support groups for single parents, community programs. You don't have to do this alone." But he was alone. That was the point. The November rain had started by the time Gideon pushed Rosie's transport incubator through the hospital's main entrance. The automatic doors opened with that pneumatic sigh, and cold air slapped him across the face with the smell of wet asphalt and car exhaust. Somewhere across the parking lot, a car alarm shrieked its electronic panic into the gray afternoon. Gideon's truck, a 1997 Ford pickup with more rust than paint, sat in the far corner of the lot, where he'd parked it 3 days ago when Leah's water had broken during an argument about whether they should sell the truck to pay for new headshots. The argument seemed absurd now, like something from another lifetime entirely. The truck's passenger door required a specific combination of lifting and pulling to open. Gideon had explained this quirk to Leah dozens of times, but she'd always made him drive her places anyway, complaining about the smell of engine oil that had seeped into the upholstery. Now, as he wrestled with the door while rain soaked through his jacket, his only jacket, he felt a bitter gratitude for the truck's reliability. It started on the second try, coughing exhaust into the rain. Securing the incubator in the passenger seat required his belt and a bungee cord he found in the truck bed. The whole arrangement looked like something from a post-apocalyptic movie, but it held. Rosie slept through the entire process, her tiny fists clenched beside her face, tubes still connected to a portable oxygen tank the hospital had provided. The drive to what used to be his apartment took 17 minutes. 17 minutes of windshield wipers that left smears across his vision. 17 minutes of radio static because the antenna had broken off last winter. 17 minutes of Gideon's mind spinning through an endless loop of how thoroughly his life had detonated. The apartment building rose out of the rain like a tombstone, 6 stories of water-stained concrete and rusted fire escapes, and Gideon parked in the loading zone and left the hazard lights blinking. The dumpster behind the building was exactly where Leah had said it would be. A green industrial container that reeked of rotted vegetables and something worse, something biological and final. His belongings had been thrown in without ceremony. The guitar case lay at the bottom, crushed under a box of his clothes. The books were scattered, their pages already bloating with moisture. Gideon stood in the rain and stared into the dumpster, feeling something inside him calcify into a harder substance. He thought about climbing in, salvaging what he could. Then he thought about Rosie in the truck, alone and vulnerable, and turned away. Some things, once lost, couldn't be recovered. The faster he accepted that, the faster he could move forward. The apartment manager, a woman named Dolores, who smelled perpetually of menthol cigarettes and wore velour tracksuits in colors found nowhere in nature, was waiting in the lobby when Gideon walked in, carrying Rosie's incubator. Rain dripped from his clothes onto the linoleum that had been beige sometime in the previous century. "Your girlfriend changed the locks," Dolores announced, as if this information might be news. "Said you weren't on the lease anymore." "She's not my girlfriend." The words came out flat. "And I was never on the lease. She made sure of that." Dolores shrugged, a gesture that conveyed both sympathy and an absolute unwillingness to get involved. "There's a youth hostel on Brenner Street, which they take men with kids sometimes." The youth hostel on Brenner Street was famous for two things: bedbugs and a shooting that had happened in the parking lot the previous spring. Gideon had driven past it enough times to know the windows were covered with bars, and the entrance was monitored by a security guard who looked like he'd given up on life around the same time as the building itself. "Thanks," Gideon said, knowing he wouldn't go there. Couldn't go there. Not with Rosie. He spent that night in the truck, parked under a broken streetlight, behind a closed furniture store. Rosie woke every 2 hours, her cries thin and reedy, the sound of something fragile threatening to break. Gideon fed her with the formula samples the hospital had provided, mixing them with bottled water because the truck obviously had no running water. He changed her diaper on his lap, the smell of urine mixing with the truck's permanent odor of oil and old fast food. The temperature dropped as the night progressed. Gideon ran the engine every 30 minutes to keep the heater cycling, watching the fuel gauge tick downward with each interval. He'd need to fill up tomorrow. Filling up would cost money he didn't have. Everything cost money he didn't have. Somewhere around 4 in the morning, while Rosie slept against his chest and rain hammered the truck's metal roof, Gideon made a decision. Actually, several decisions, each one clicking into place like the chambers of a revolver. 1. He would never again put his faith in someone else's promises. 2. He would work whatever jobs necessary to keep Rosie fed and warm, no matter how the work degraded him. And 3. He would build something for her, some kind of future that didn't involve hospital debt and sleeping in trucks. 4. If he ever saw Leah again, he would show her exactly what she'd thrown away. These weren't plans exactly. They were something harder. Vows, maybe, or threats made to the universe itself. The rain continued. Rosie breathed. Gideon stayed awake and watched the windshield fog with their shared exhalations, each breath a small act of defiance against everything trying to crush them. The warehouse job ended 2 weeks later. Not fired exactly. The supervisor had called it position elimination due to seasonal fluctuations, which was corporate language for, "We found someone who didn't need to leave every few hours to check on an infant in the break room." Gideon had tried to make it work. He'd begged the supervisor for flexibility, explained his situation with enough humiliating detail that the man had looked away. But businesses ran on efficiency, not sympathy, and a worker who spent half his shift mixing formula bottles and changing diapers in his truck during lunch breaks was not efficient. The severance check, $217 after taxes, lasted 5 days. The job center smelled like floor wax and defeat. It occupied the ground floor of a municipal building that also housed the parole office and the DMV, so the waiting room was always packed with people radiating various intensities of desperation. Gideon sat in a plastic chair with Rosie strapped to his chest, in a carrier he'd fashioned from a bedsheet and YouTube tutorials. The carrier worked, more or less, though Rosie's weight pulled on his lower back in a way that promised chronic pain somewhere down the line. Number 73, the speaker system crackled. Gideon checked his ticket. 89. He'd been waiting an hour and 40 minutes. Rosie had been mercifully quiet, sleeping against his chest, her small body generating a pocket of warmth that was almost pleasant. Almost. The man next to him, somewhere in his 50s, with the yellowed fingers of a lifetime smoker, leaned over. First time? First time at the center. I can always tell. You still got that look, like you think this is temporary. Gideon didn't respond. What was there to say? Yes, he believed this was temporary. Had to believe it, because the alternative was accepting that this waiting room, with its fluorescent lights and posters about building your employment future, represented his life now. Number 74. Gets faster after the first few visits, the man continued. You learn the rhythm. Which clerks to avoid, which days they're processing applications quicker. Tuesday mornings are good. Friday afternoons are hell. It was a Friday afternoon. By the time they called number 89, Rosie had woken up and started fussing. Not crying yet, but making those preliminary sounds that would soon escalate into full panic if she wasn't fed. Gideon approached the counter with Rosie's sounds, providing percussion to his humiliation. The clerk, her name tag said Barbara, looked at him over reading glasses that hung on a chain around her neck. Employment category? General labor, warehousing, loading, construction, or anything. Barbara's fingers moved across a keyboard that had been manufactured when computers were still beige. Prior experience? Gideon rattled off his work history. 5 years at the warehouse. Before that, a season doing road construction. Before that, various fast food positions during and after high school. Nothing impressive. Nothing that suggested he'd ever been meant for anything beyond manual labor and minimum wage. Current address. This was the question Gideon had been dreading. I'm between residences at the moment. Barbara looked up. Her expression didn't change, but something shifted behind her eyes. Recognition, maybe. She'd seen this story before. We need a mailing address for payment processing. I can use a P.O. box. P.O. boxes require rental fees. I'm aware. The silence stretched. Rosie's fussing intensified. Barbara glanced at the baby carrier, then back at her screen. There's a temporary labor program through Denison Industrial Services. They provide day work assignments, kitchen cleaning mostly, commercial facilities. The pay is minimum wage, and you only work the days they call you. I'll take it. It's not steady income. I'll take whatever you have. Barbara printed out a form and slid it across the counter. Fill this out and bring it to this address by Monday morning, 5 a.m. Wear boots if you have them. The work involves a lot of standing and exposure to cleaning chemicals. Gideon took the form. His handwriting, as he filled it out right there at the counter, looked shaky. Sleep deprivation, probably, or the beginning stages of realizing how far he'd fallen. The address Barbara had given him led to a parking lot behind a strip mall where a white van idled every morning at 5. The van reeked of bleach and sweat, and the other workers, mostly men, a few women, all with the same exhausted eyes, barely looked at Gideon when he climbed in that first Monday morning with Rosie still asleep in her carrier. The crew chief, a man named Hector, with forearms like bridge cables, took one look at the baby and shook his head. "You can't bring a kid to the job sites." "I don't have childcare." "Not my problem." "Then what am I supposed to do?" Hector lit a cigarette, took a drag, and exhaled toward the van's open door. "There's a woman named Ruth who runs a daycare out of her house on Polk Street. Sometimes she takes charity cases. Sometimes. But you better have something to offer besides sob stories." Ruth Alvarez's house was a narrow 2-story structure, painted the color of faded sunflowers, wedged between a laundromat and a tax preparation office that was only open during tax season. A chain-link fence enclosed the small front yard, where a collection of weathered plastic toys lay scattered in the dead grass. Gideon knocked on the door at 6:30 in the morning, Rosie crying against his chest because she was hungry and he'd run out of formula the night before. He'd meant to stop at the store, but by the time the van had dropped him off after the first day's work, 12 hours cleaning a restaurant kitchen with grease so thick it had to be scraped off the floor with putty knives, every store in the neighborhood had been closed. The woman who answered the door was probably 60, though she could have been older. Her gray hair was pulled back in a bun, and she wore an apron covered in cartoon characters that had been popular a decade ago. Behind her, Gideon could hear children's voices and the tinny sound of a television playing morning cartoons. "I can't pay you," Gideon said before Ruth could speak. "Not right now. I just started a job, and I won't see a check for 2 weeks. But I'm desperate." And Hector Ramirez said, "You might—" "Hector sent you," Ruth interrupted. "Yes, ma'am." Ruth looked at Rosie, then at Gideon. Her gaze lingered on his boots, steel-toed work boots that were held together with duct tape, where the sole had separated from the leather. "What's the child's name?" "Rosie." "How old?" 6 weeks, premature. She still needs specialized formula." "And the mother?" "Gone." That single word seemed to communicate everything Ruth needed to know. She stepped back and opened the door wider. "Bring her in. I'll watch her today. We'll discuss arrangements when you pick her up tonight." Gideon wanted to cry, wanted to fall to his knees and thank this woman who was offering him the one thing that would allow him to work. But he just nodded, blinking hard, and stepped into the warm chaos of Ruth's home. The work with Denison Industrial Services was brutal in ways that made his warehouse job seem like vacation. The crew cleaned restaurant kitchens after closing, arriving at facilities after midnight, and working until the prep cooks showed up at dawn. Gideon scrubbed grease from exhaust hoods, scoured walk-in freezers, and emptied grease traps that made his stomach revolt even after the 100th time. His hands cracked from the chemicals. His back ached from bending over industrial sinks. He fell asleep on the van, ride back to the parking lot every morning, then walked 3 blocks to Ruth's house to collect Rosie before stumbling back to the truck. The truck had become their home. Gideon parked it in different locations each night, moving whenever security guards or police told him to move along. He kept their belongings, what few they had, in plastic storage bins in the truck bed, covered with a tarp he'd found behind a hardware store. He washed Rosie's bottles in gas station bathrooms and heated her formula with hot water from convenience store coffee machines. Winter came hard that year. The truck's heater worked intermittently, and on the coldest nights, Gideon ran the engine for as long as he dared, knowing he was slowly poisoning them both with carbon monoxide, but unable to watch Rosie turn blue from the cold. He bought a cheap space heater from a thrift store and rigged it to run off the truck's battery using cables and adapters from an auto parts shop. The heater worked for 3 days before shorting out and nearly starting a fire. Ruth noticed. Of course she noticed. It was impossible to hide the smell of exhaust that clung to Gideon's clothes, or the way he showed up every morning looking like he'd aged a year overnight. One evening when he arrived to pick up Rosie, Ruth was waiting with a proposition. "I have a basement. It's not much, just a storage space with a bathroom and a utility sink. But there's electricity and heating, and it's dry. You can stay there in exchange for helping me with repairs around the house." Gideon stared at her. "I can't accept that." "You can, and you will. That child needs stability. I barely know you. And I barely know you. But I know what I'm looking at. A man trying to do right by his daughter. That's enough." The basement was everything Ruth had said. A concrete room with exposed pipes running across the ceiling and a single window at ground level that let in grey light. But it was warm, it was dry, and it was theirs. Gideon moved them in that night, carrying down the plastic storage bins and setting up a corner with blankets and pillows from the Salvation Army store. He fashioned a changing table from a piece of plywood and milk crates. He bought a hot plate from a yard sale and cooked basic meals, ramen, canned soup, and scrambled eggs when he could afford the eggs. The arrangement with Ruth was simple. Gideon did repairs. He fixed her sagging porch steps, replaced sections of rotted siding, and resealed her bathroom tiles. In return, she watched Rosie during the day and charged him nothing for the basement space. It wasn't charity, Ruth insisted. It was barter, a fair exchange. But Gideon knew it was more. It was grace, the kind he'd never expected after Leah. The work at Denison continued. Gideon picked up every shift they offered, sometimes working 7 days a week. He learned which restaurant managers tipped the cleaning crews and which ones complained about the quality of work, no matter how perfectly they cleaned. He learned to eat the food that restaurants threw away at the end of the night, perfectly good meals that regulations prohibited them from serving but allowed them to discard. He saved what little money he could. $50 one week, $30 the next. Some weeks there was nothing to save after formula, diapers, and the minimal groceries he bought. But slowly, painfully slowly, a small cushion began to build. Rosie grew, 3 months old, 4 months, 6 months. She started to smile, real smiles that crinkled her whole face, not the random muscle movements of a newborn. The first time she laughed, a real belly laugh at something stupid Gideon was doing with a stuffed animal Ruth had given her, he sat on the basement floor and wept into his hands. Ruth found him like that, in tears streaming down his face, while Rosie kicked her legs and giggled. "What's wrong?" "Nothing," Gideon managed. "Nothing at all." She laughed. "She's happy. After everything, she's happy." Ruth knelt beside him, her knees cracking with the effort. Children are resilient. She doesn't know what she's survived. She just knows she's loved. "I'm failing her every day." "You're showing up every day. That's not the same as failing." But it felt like failing. It felt like running in place while the world spun faster around him. Other men his age he was 27, though he felt 50, were building careers, buying houses, taking vacations. Gideon was celebrating the luxury of 3 consecutive nights without rain waking him up through the truck's leaky window seal. He discovered the library on a Tuesday afternoon when he had a rare day off. The building was old stone, with carved letters above the entrance that read, "The Palace of the People." Gideon had walked past it 100 times, but never gone inside. Libraries were for people with time, with leisure, not for men who smelled like grease and industrial solvent. But Rosie needed somewhere warm to spend the afternoon, while Ruth attended a doctor's appointment, and the library was free. The children's section occupied the entire basement level. It was bright, with painted murals on the walls and small chairs arranged around low tables. A librarian, younger than Gideon, with colorful tattoos covering her arms, smiled when he walked in with Rosie. "Story time starts in 10 minutes if you want to join." Gideon almost said no, almost backed out, and found somewhere else to kill time. But then Rosie reached for one of the board books on display, and he heard himself say, "We'd like that." Story time was chaotic and loud, and nothing like the reverent silence Gideon had expected from a library. The librarian read with different voices for each character, and the dozen or so children sitting cross-legged on the carpet shouted out predictions and observations. Rosie watched with wide eyes, mesmerized. After story time, Gideon wandered upstairs to the adult section, while Rosie dozed in her carrier. He found himself in the business section, staring at titles about entrepreneurship and financial planning. Books written by people who'd started with advantages he'd never had. Family money, college degrees, connections. But there were other books too. Memoirs of people who'd climbed out of worse situations. As guides to starting businesses with nothing. Technical manuals on subjects Gideon had never considered. He checked out 3 books that day, feeling slightly ridiculous as he handed his brand new library card to the front desk clerk. When was he going to find time to read? Every spare moment went to Rosie, or to sleeping, or to the endless maintenance required to keep their lives from falling apart completely. But he read anyway, 10 minutes before bed, 20 minutes during the van rides to job sites, an hour on Sunday afternoons while Rosie napped. The books opened doorways to worlds he'd never considered. Not escape fantasies, but practical possibilities, business models, systems thinking, the mechanics of how money actually worked beyond the paycheck-to-paycheck survival he'd always known. One book, and written by a man who'd started a waste management company from a single truck, contained a sentence that Gideon copied into a notebook he'd started keeping. Most people fail because they quit before the compound effect has time to work. Success isn't a lightning strike. It's the accumulation of 1,000 small decisions made over years. Years. Gideon was 27. If he worked another 3, 4, 5 years like this, really worked, not just survived, what could he build? What kind of life could he create for Rosie? The idea started as a whisper, then a persistent voice, then something louder that kept him awake at night, staring at the exposed pipes in Ruth's basement ceiling. Everyone needed clean water, restaurants especially, hotels, hospitals, office buildings. They all had complex plumbing systems that required regular maintenance and specialized equipment. The industrial cleaning crew saw it every shift. Clogged grease traps, mineral buildup in pipes, water filtration systems that malfunctioned because nobody understood how to properly maintain them. What if someone offered a specialized service? Not general plumbing, which was oversaturated with competition, but specialized water system maintenance. preventative care, rather than emergency fixes. A subscription model where businesses paid monthly for regular inspections and maintenance, preventing the expensive catastrophes that shut down kitchens and cost thousands in repairs. The idea was probably stupid. Gideon had no business experience, no capital, no credentials beyond a high school diploma and calloused hands. But the idea wouldn't go away. He started researching. The library had internet access, and Gideon spent his breaks between childcare and work looking up information about business licenses, certification programs, and equipment costs. The numbers were staggering. Even a minimal setup would require at least $15,000, more money than Gideon had ever possessed in his entire life. But there were paths: community college courses in commercial plumbing and water system management, small business loans for low-income entrepreneurs, certification programs that could be completed on weekends over the course of a year. It would mean working even harder than he already was. It would mean years of operating on even less sleep, less money, less margin for error. But it would also mean building something, at an asset that couldn't be thrown in a dumpster or destroyed by someone else's whims. Gideon enrolled in a weekend certification program at the community college, using half of his emergency savings to pay the registration fee. The classes ran Saturday mornings, which meant asking Ruth for extra childcare and finding a way to stay awake through lectures after working all-night shifts. The other students were younger, mostly recent high school graduates taking vocational courses because they couldn't afford four-year universities. A few older workers looking to change careers. Nobody brought a baby to class. Nobody else showed up wearing clothes that still smelled like yesterday's commercial kitchen. But Gideon didn't care. Let them stare. Let them wonder about the guy who took notes like his life depended on it. Because it did. And Ruth Alvarez didn't ask questions she didn't need answered. That was one of the first things Gideon learned about her. She didn't probe into why Leah had left, didn't demand explanations for the bruises of exhaustion under his eyes, didn't comment on the weeks when he could barely scrape together enough money to buy Rosie's formula and had to choose between eating and keeping gas in the truck. Instead, Ruth made extra portions of dinner: rice and beans, chicken stew, tamales wrapped in corn husks, and left them covered on the kitchen counter where Gideon would find them when he picked up Rosie each evening. She never said they were for him, just left them there, like she'd accidentally cooked too much. Gideon pretended not to understand what she was doing. Pride required it. The basement became more livable over the months, and Gideon installed better lighting, patched the cracks in the concrete walls, and built crude furniture from salvaged wood and hardware store clearance items. He created a separate sleeping area for Rosie, hanging a curtain from the ceiling pipes to give her a sense of enclosure. The space heater, a different one, properly rated and wired, kept the temperature above freezing even during the worst cold snaps. It wasn't much, but it was theirs. More importantly, it was stable. Rosie's first birthday came on a Tuesday in February. Gideon had been working for Denison Industrial Services for 8 months by then, and his body had adapted to the grinding routine. Sleep from 9 in the morning until 3 in the afternoon, wake up and spend time with Rosie until Ruth closed the daycare at 6. He'd then catch a few more hours of rest before the van picked him up at midnight. Ruth insisted on throwing Rosie a party. Just a small gathering. The other daycare children and their parents, plus Hector from the cleaning crew, who'd become something like a friend over the shared misery of late-night kitchen work. Ruth baked a cake from scratch, decorated with clumsy frosting flowers and a single candle. Watching Rosie smash her tiny fists into the cake frosting covering her face while the other children shrieked with laughter, Gideon felt a dangerous emotion stirring in his chest. Something adjacent to hope. Like maybe, despite everything, they were going to be okay. "She's thriving," Ruth said, appearing beside him with a paper plate of cake. "You're doing good work." Gideon. "I'm barely keeping us above water." Above water is still above. Don't discount that. Ruth had a way of reframing things, taking situations that felt like failure and showing Gideon the small victories hidden inside. Yes, they lived in a basement, but it was warm and dry. Yes, he worked brutal hours, but he was working, providing. Yes, he was tired all the time, but Rosie was healthy, hitting her developmental milestones, laughing and playing like any other child. "I'm going to pay you back," Gideon said, "for everything. Once I get on my feet properly, I'm going to—" "You'll do no such thing." Ruth's voice carried a steel edge he'd rarely heard. "This isn't a loan. This is what people do. They help each other. You needed help. I had help to give. That's the end of the transaction." "But, Gideon," Ruth turned to face him fully. "When my husband died, I lost everything. The house, the savings, all of it. Medical bills. I ended up in a shelter with my 3 kids. We ate in soup kitchens, wore donated clothes. I know what it feels like to be where you are, and I know what it meant when someone extended a hand without expecting anything back." Gideon hadn't known this. Ruth never talked about her past, never offered her own story as currency in the exchange of hardship narratives. He looked at her now, this woman with grey hair and worn hands who'd somehow maintained enough compassion to help a stranger, and understood that Ruth wasn't saving him. She was passing forward a gift someone had once given her. "Thank you," he managed. Thank me by doing the same for someone else when you're able. That's how this works." The community college certification program proved harder than Gideon had anticipated. The coursework assumed a baseline of knowledge about hydraulics, chemistry, and commercial building codes that he simply didn't have. The other students, even the younger ones, seemed to grasp concepts that left Gideon confused and frustrated. He failed the first exam, scored a 53% on a test about water pressure systems and backflow prevention. The instructor, a retired plumber named Mr. Kowalski, who'd installed pipe systems in buildings all over the state, handed back the exam with a sympathetic look that made Gideon want to crawl into a hole. "See me after class," Mr. Kowalski said. After class, with the other students filing out and the fluorescent lights humming in the empty classroom, Mr. Kowalski leaned against his desk and crossed his arms. "You're working nights?" "Yes, sir." "And you've got a kid?" "Yes, sir." "Then you're trying to learn this material on what 4 hours of sleep?" Gideon didn't answer. The answer was obvious. Mr. Kowalski sighed. "Look, I'm not supposed to do this, but I've got office hours on Sunday afternoons when nobody shows up. If you want to come in, I'll work through the concepts with you one-on-one. No charge, no special treatment on the exams. Just help understanding the fundamentals." "I don't want charity." "It's not charity, it's teaching. That's literally my job. Whether I'm teaching you in a classroom of 20 students or just you by yourself, I'm getting paid the same." Gideon started attending the Sunday sessions. Mr. Kowalski broke down the material into pieces Gideon could actually digest, using real-world examples from job sites instead of abstract textbook diagrams. He explained why certain regulations existed, what happened when systems failed, how to diagnose problems before they became emergencies. Slowly, painfully slowly, Gideon began to understand. The next exam, he scored a 72, then an 81. By the end of the first semester, he was pulling consistent B grades and actually comprehending what he read. "You've got a knack for this," Mr. Kowalski said during one of their Sunday sessions. "Not the book learning part. That's always going to be harder for you. But the practical application, the way you think through problems. And that's rare. I just don't want to mess up and flood someone's building." That's exactly the right attitude. Half the disasters I've seen in this industry came from guys who thought they knew everything. You're willing to admit what you don't know. That makes you better than most. The certification program took 18 months. 18 months of weekend classes, Sunday tutoring sessions, late-night study sessions in the basement while Rosie slept, and practical examinations that required Gideon to demonstrate competency with tools and systems he'd barely touched before starting the program. He passed the final certification exam with an 86%. Not perfect, but sufficient. When Mr. Kowalski handed him the official certificate, embossed paper declaring Gideon Carver a certified commercial water systems technician, Gideon felt something shift in his chest. Not pride exactly, more like the solid click of a door unlocking. "What's next?" Mr. Kowalski asked. "I'm going to start a business." "With what capital?" "I don't know yet." Mr. Kowalski smiled. "Then you're right on schedule. Most successful businesses start with someone who's got more ambition than sense. The trick is surviving long enough for the sense to catch up." Starting the business required licenses, insurance, equipment, and a business plan, detailed enough to convince a bank to take a chance on a guy whose credit score looked like a batting average. Gideon spent 3 months working on the loan application, filling out forms that seemed designed to humiliate him with their demands for financial history, collateral, and professional references. The first bank rejected him immediately. So did the second and third. The fourth bank, a small community development credit union that specialized in microloans for low-income entrepreneurs, at least granted him an interview. The loan officer was a woman named Veronica Chen, who listened to Gideon's pitch with the weary expression of someone who'd heard 1,000 similar proposals and funded maybe a dozen. Gideon showed her the business plan he'd developed: Clearwater Solutions, a specialized water system maintenance company targeting commercial kitchens and hospitality businesses. Monthly subscription model. Preventative maintenance to avoid expensive emergency repairs. And competitive pricing undercut the big plumbing companies while still remaining profitable. "What makes you different from the established companies?" Veronica asked. "I'll actually show up when scheduled. I'll answer phone calls. And I'll do the work right the first time instead of padding the bill with unnecessary repairs." That's a pretty low bar. You'd be surprised how many companies can't clear it. Veronica Chen approved a loan of $8,000 at 14% interest. It wasn't enough to fully equip the business, but it was a start. Gideon used the money to purchase a used commercial pressure washer, basic plumbing tools, water testing equipment, and enough specialized cleaning solutions to handle a dozen jobs. He registered the business, bought liability insurance, and had business cards printed at a copy shop that charged 15 cents per card. The truck became a mobile workshop. Gideon installed a custom rack system in the bed to hold equipment, added a weatherproof storage box, and painted Clearwater Solutions on both doors in vinyl lettering that cost $40, but looked almost professional. Getting the first customer required weeks of cold calling. Gideon visited every restaurant, hotel, and commercial kitchen within a 30-mile radius, introducing himself and leaving behind business cards and informational flyers he'd designed himself. Most managers took the card out of politeness and threw it away the moment Gideon walked out. A few kept it. One actually called. The first job was a restaurant called the Copper Kettle, a mid-range breakfast place that had been dealing with recurring grease trap problems. The owner, a stressed man in his 50s named Phil, had been quoted $3,000 by a major plumbing company to replace the entire grease trap system. Gideon inspected the system and diagnosed the problem in 20 minutes. The trap wasn't failing, it just wasn't being maintained correctly. The kitchen staff was pouring cooking oil directly down the drains, overwhelming the trap's capacity. He cleaned out the existing trap, installed a simple oil collection system, and trained the kitchen staff on proper waste disposal procedures. Total cost to the customer, $450. Phil was ecstatic. He immediately signed up for Clearwater Solutions' monthly maintenance plan, $99 per month for regular inspections and cleaning. Then he told 3 other restaurant owners who also called Gideon. By Rosie's second birthday, Clearwater Solutions had 11 monthly clients and enough revenue that Gideon could finally quit the night shift work with Denison Industrial Services. Not wealthy, not comfortable, but stable. Actually, genuinely stable. Ruth cried when Gideon told her the news. "I knew you'd make it. I haven't made anything yet. This is just the beginning." Exactly. Ruth hugged him, something she rarely did. The beginning is the hardest part. Everything else is just momentum. The business grew in ways that surprised Gideon. Not explosive growth, nothing viral or overnight, but steady and compounding growth that came from doing consistent good work and solving problems the big companies ignored. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source: hospital kitchens. Hospitals had massive commercial kitchens that operated around the clock, feeding patients, staff, and visitors. They also had strict health department regulations and zero tolerance for system failures that could compromise patient safety. The major plumbing companies charged premium rates for hospital work, often taking weeks to schedule routine maintenance because they prioritized higher-margin emergency calls. Gideon realized he could own this niche. He obtained additional certifications in medical facility compliance, invested in specialized testing equipment that could detect potential contaminants in water systems, and then developed a preventative maintenance protocol specifically designed for healthcare facilities. His pitch to hospital administrators was simple. For less than what they currently paid for reactive emergency repairs, Clearwater Solutions would provide proactive system monitoring that prevented problems before they started. Every month, guaranteed inspections. Every quarter, comprehensive system analysis. Annual compliance reports ready for health department audits. The first hospital that signed on was a small community facility in the suburbs. 15,000 square feet of kitchen space across multiple floors. The administrator, a woman named Patricia, who'd been dealing with a recurring boiler issue that kept shutting down hot water to the patient floors, took a chance on Gideon after the third plumbing company failed to permanently fix the problem. Gideon solved it in a day. The issue wasn't the boiler, it was calcium buildup in the feeder pipes that caused pressure fluctuations. He installed a water softener system and implemented a descaling protocol. The boiler never malfunctioned again. Patricia became Clearwater Solutions' most valuable advocate. She referred Gideon to 3 other healthcare facilities, all of which became clients. Hospital kitchens, it turned out, talked to each other. Kitchen managers switched facilities, but remembered the reliable contractor who actually answered his phone and showed up on schedule. Within 3 years of starting the business, Clearwater Solutions had 43 contracted clients across 8 counties. Gideon hired his first employee, a younger guy named Troy, who just finished the same certification program Gideon had completed. Then a second employee, an older technician named Bernard, who'd been laid off when his previous employer went bankrupt. Gideon moved out of Ruth's basement when Rosie turned 4. Not because Ruth asked him to, but because he finally could. He rented a small 2-bedroom apartment in a building that didn't smell like mold and had working heat in every room. The apartment had a real kitchen, a bathroom with a door that closed, and windows that looked out onto an actual street instead of ground-level concrete. The first night in the new apartment, Gideon sat on the floor. They didn't have much furniture yet, and watched Rosie run from room to room, her laughter echoing off the empty walls. She claimed the smaller bedroom as her own, demanding that Gideon paint it purple. He did, spending an entire Saturday applying 3 coats of purple paint that was probably too bright, but made Rosie squeal with delight. This was success. Not wealth or luxury, but the simple dignity of a home that was truly theirs. The business continued expanding. Gideon developed a specialized niche within the niche: water filtration and purification systems for food service operations that catered to specific dietary needs: kosher kitchens, halal facilities, allergen-free food preparation spaces. These clients needed absolute assurance that their water systems wouldn't cross-contaminate, and they were willing to pay premium rates for that certainty. The Clearwater Solutions became known as the company that understood the difference between meeting code and exceeding client expectations. Gideon trained his employees in the same obsessive attention to detail he'd developed during those brutal years working night shifts. Show up on time, do the work correctly, answer the phone, follow through on promises, basic principles that apparently constituted competitive advantages. By year 5, the company was generating enough revenue that Gideon had to hire an accountant just to manage the financial complexity. The accountant, a no-nonsense woman named Brenda, who worked out of a shared office space downtown, looked at Clearwater Solutions books and shook her head. "You're undercharging," she announced. "My prices are competitive. Your prices are stupid. You're providing services that your competitors charge 50% more for, and you're doing it better. Raise your rates." "I'll lose clients." "You'll lose the clients who only care about price. Those are bad clients anyway. The good ones, the ones who understand value, will stay, and you'll have room to hire more staff, which means taking on better contracts." Gideon raised his rates by 30%. He lost 3 clients and gained 7 new ones in the following 2 months. Brenda had been right. The accountant also pushed Gideon to think bigger. "You've built a service company that depends entirely on your personal reputation and relationships. What happens if you get sick? What if you want to expand beyond what you can personally oversee?" "I don't know. I've been focused on survival. You're not strategy." "Then it's time to focus on strategy. You need to systematize this. Turn Clearwater Solutions from a business that requires Gideon Carver into a business that runs without him." The process took 2 years. Gideon documented every aspect of the company's operations: diagnostic protocols, maintenance procedures, client communication standards, equipment specifications. He created training manuals for new hires, developed quality control checklists, and implemented scheduling software that managed the company's increasingly complex logistics. He promoted Troy to operations manager, giving him responsibility for day-to-day technical work. He hired a customer service coordinator named Denise to handle client communications and scheduling. He moved Clearwater Solutions out of his truck and into an actual office, a small warehouse space on the industrial side of town where they could store equipment, conduct training, and maintain a professional presence. The company's client roster expanded beyond restaurants and hospitals, hotels, corporate office buildings, food processing plants, university dining facilities. Any operation that needed reliable water system management and couldn't afford the downtime that came with emergency failures. Clearwater Solutions developed a reputation for solving problems nobody else wanted to touch. The grease trap system that had been malfunctioning for months despite multiple repair attempts. The mysterious contamination in a hotel's water supply that health inspectors couldn't trace. The restaurant chain that needed a standardized maintenance protocol rolled out across 17 locations. Gideon became known in industry circles as the guy who actually understood water systems rather than just replacing parts until something worked. He was invited to speak at a regional plumbing contractors conference, which felt absurd, given that 7 years ago he'd been sleeping in his truck, and ended up landing 3 major contracts from property management companies that attended the presentation. The business hit $1 million in annual revenue during year 7. Gideon almost didn't believe it when Brenda showed him the year-end financial statements. $1 million. Not profit. The expenses were substantial, but revenue. Actual and real money flowing through a business he'd started with an $8,000 loan and a used pressure washer. "You need to start thinking about succession planning," Brenda said. "Business valuation, exit strategy." "I'm not exiting. I built this." "I'm not saying sell tomorrow. I'm saying think 10 years ahead. What does Clearwater Solutions look like when Rosie graduates high school, when she goes to college? Do you want to be crawling under sinks at 50? Or do you want this company to be an asset that generates income without requiring your daily involvement?" Gideon had never thought that far ahead. The future had always been measured in weeks, months at most. But Brenda was right. He'd built something with actual value, something that could be grown, scaled, maybe even franchised to other markets. But for the first time since that horrible night in the hospital, Gideon allowed himself to think about true financial security. Not just survival, but wealth. The kind of wealth that meant Rosie could attend any college she wanted. The kind that meant he never again had to choose between food and formula, heat and medicine. He hired a business consultant, an expensive proposition that made him nervous until he saw the results. The consultant helped Clearwater Solutions develop a 5-year expansion plan, targeting mid-sized cities within a 200-mile radius. The strategy was to replicate the model, find underserved markets where commercial water system maintenance was dominated by expensive, unreliable contractors, then offer superior service at competitive prices. Gideon opened the first satellite office in year 8, a smaller operation in a city 90 miles away, staffed by 2 technicians he'd personally trained. The satellite struggled initially. Building client relationships from scratch was harder than Gideon had anticipated, but within 6 months, it was generating enough revenue to cover costs. The second satellite office, opened 6 months later in a different market, performed better. By the end of year 8, Clearwater Solutions operated 3 locations and employed 18 people. Gideon spent most of his time managing operations, handling major client relationships, and planning further expansion. He bought a house, an actual house with a yard and a garage, and enough bedrooms that Rosie had space for her own playroom. The house wasn't fancy, 3 bedrooms in a middle-class neighborhood with decent schools, but it was theirs. No landlord could evict them. No building manager could raise the rent. Just a mortgage that Gideon could easily afford. The truck, the same Ford pickup that had been their home during the worst months, sat in the garage now, semi-retired but maintained because Gideon couldn't bring himself to sell it. Troy joked that Gideon should have it bronzed, turned into some kind of company mascot, but Gideon just kept changing its oil and replacing parts as they wore out, preserving this artifact of who he'd been. Ruth visited the new house the week they moved in. She walked through the rooms with Rosie, giving her a tour, pointing out where all the toys would go, which bathroom would be hers, how the backyard had a tree perfect for a swing. "You did it," Ruth said when the tour ended and they stood in the kitchen. The enormous and modern kitchen with granite countertops and stainless appliances. "We did it," Gideon corrected. "I wouldn't be here without you." "You'd have found another way. Men like you always do." Men like me? Men who refuse to quit, who show up every day even when showing up feels impossible. Ruth touched his arm. "I knew you'd make something of yourself. I just didn't know it would happen this fast." 8 years isn't fast. It is when you start from zero. Most people never make it out of the hole you climbed out of. Gideon thought about that later, after Ruth had left and Rosie was asleep in her new purple bedroom. 8 years, from a hospital waiting room and a truck parked behind a closed furniture store to a house with a yard and a business worth millions. It should have felt triumphant, should have felt like vindication. Instead, it felt like the first breath after nearly drowning. Relief, yes, but also the bone-deep exhaustion of survival. Leah Hartwell, she'd gone back to her maiden name after leaving Gideon, erasing even that connection to the life she'd rejected, stared at the overdue notice from her storage unit facility and calculated how many modeling gigs she'd need to book in the next 2 weeks to avoid losing everything she'd accumulated over the past 8 years. The math didn't work. It never worked anymore. The modeling career that was supposed to explode had sputtered instead. A few local campaigns, some catalog work, a brief stint as a promotional model for a vodka brand that went bankrupt after 6 months. Nothing that resembled the Fashion Week appearances and magazine covers she'd imagined when she walked out of that hospital. She was 32 now, which in modeling terms might as well be ancient. The agencies that had once returned her calls now ghosted her emails. The photographers who'd shot her portfolio had moved on to younger faces, girls who were 19 and looked like they'd been assembled in some laboratory of perfect bone structure and metabolically impossible thinness. Leah's apartment, a studio in a building that had been trendy 5 years ago before the neighborhood gentrified beyond its original cool factor, smelled like the Thai takeout she'd eaten 3 days ago and forgotten to throw away. Clothes covered every surface. Rejected outfits from casting she hadn't booked. Dry cleaning she couldn't afford to pick up. Laundry that had been sitting in a basket for 2 weeks. Her phone buzzed. A text from her roommate. Ex-roommate now, technically, and since Natalie had moved out last month without paying her share of utilities, asking if Leah had found someone to take over the lease. Leah deleted the text without responding. She hadn't found anyone. Nobody wanted to pay $1,800 a month to live in a studio apartment with a shower that only produced scalding hot or ice-cold water. No in-between. The casting call was for a commercial. Pharmaceutical company advertising some medication for middle-aged women. The role descriptions specified authentic, relatable, mature, which was industry code for older but not too old, attractive but not threatening. Leah arrived 20 minutes late because the subway had delays. The waiting room was packed with women who all looked vaguely like her. Same age range, the same carefully maintained appearance of casual effortlessness that actually required 2 hours of preparation. They all had the same portfolio books, the same desperate energy masked by affected boredom. The casting director called her name after a 40-minute wait. Leah walked into the small studio space, handed over her portfolio, and delivered her prepared lines to the camera. The casting director, a kid who looked maybe 25, wearing a hoodie and pristine white sneakers that probably cost more than Leah's rent, nodded without visible enthusiasm. "Thanks. We'll be in touch." They wouldn't be in touch. Leah knew the tone. She'd heard it at 30 castings over the past 6 months. She was too old, too expensive, too much of the wrong thing, and not enough of whatever they actually wanted. Walking back to the subway, Leah caught her reflection in a storefront window. She looked tired. Not the artful tired that could be styled for editorial shoots, but the real tired of someone barely keeping their life from collapsing. The makeup she'd applied so carefully that morning had settled into the fine lines around her eyes. Her blazer, expensive once, bought during a brief period when money had flowed, now looked dated and slightly shabby. When had this happened? When had she become the woman reflected in this window instead of the woman she'd imagined 8 years ago? The storage unit notice was still sitting on her kitchen counter when she got home. Final warning. If she didn't pay the $375 by Friday, they'd auction off the contents. The contents included furniture from the apartment she'd had to leave 2 years ago when her rent doubled, boxes of clothes and shoes she'd accumulated, various equipment she'd bought for a social media influencer career that never materialized, and photographs from the brief period when she'd been dating a minor celebrity whose name she now avoided mentioning because it made her sound pathetic. $375. Leah checked her bank account. $109. She'd made that doing bottle service last weekend at a club downtown, wearing a tight dress and heels that destroyed her feet, smiling at men who tipped 20% and assumed the smile meant something it didn't. Her phone rang. Unknown number. Leah almost didn't answer, but lately she'd been answering everything in case it was a callback. Not an opportunity. Anything. "Hello? Is this Leah Hartwell?" Male voice, professional tone. "Speaking. This is Detective Morris with the Metro Police Department. I'm calling about an outstanding warrant for failure to appear in court regarding unpaid traffic violations. Are you aware of these violations?" Leah's stomach dropped. The parking tickets. She'd forgotten about the parking tickets. 3 of them, accumulated last year when she'd been parking illegally near her various side jobs because she couldn't afford the meters. She'd meant to pay them, meant to deal with them, but they'd gotten buried under all the other things she'd meant to deal with. "I can explain. Ma'am, I need you to come to the station and address this before we escalate to active collection. Can you come in this week?" Leah agreed to whatever the detective said. He hung up and sat on her floor, the same floor that had a stain from spilled wine she'd never properly cleaned, and cried. Not dramatic tears, just the steady leak of someone who'd run out of options and was too tired to pretend otherwise. Her mother called that evening, the weekly call that Leah usually avoided, but tonight, in her state of emotional exhaustion, she answered, "How are you, sweetheart?" "I'm fine, Mom." The automatic lie. "Have you been booking more work?" "Some, here and there." Another lie. Her mother's voice carried that particular tone of concern, mixed with judgment, that Leah had been hearing since she was 16. "You know, your cousin Rebecca just got promoted. She's managing the entire Northeast region now, making 6 figures. That's great for Rebecca. I'm just saying, maybe it's time to think about something more stable. You're not getting any younger, and the modeling thing, I have to go, Mom. Someone's calling." Leah hung up before her mother could continue. The apartment felt smaller suddenly, the walls pressing in. All her life she'd been chasing something. Beauty, fame, validation, the feeling of being special. She'd sacrificed everything for that chase. Relationships, stability, even motherhood. Motherhood. Leah rarely let herself think about the baby, the daughter she'd left at the hospital with Gideon. But tonight, sitting in her failing apartment, with overdue notices and police warrants and a career that existed only in past tense, the thought crept in. The baby would be 8 years old now, in 2nd or 3rd grade, learning multiplication maybe, or how to read chapter books. Did she look like Leah? Did she have Gideon's quiet determination? Did she even know Leah existed? Leah pushed the thoughts away. She'd made the right choice. She'd been 24, broke, and unprepared for motherhood. Gideon had wanted to keep the baby, so she'd let him. Clean break, no looking back. That was the plan. But in the silence of her apartment, with the evidence of her deteriorating life scattered around her, Leah wondered if she'd made the biggest mistake of her life. Not having the baby, she still couldn't imagine herself as a mother. But leaving Gideon, maybe. He'd been stable, reliable. Boring, yes. But in hindsight, boring was starting to look like a feature rather than a flaw. She grabbed her laptop, and before she could talk herself out of it, searched for him on social media. Gideon Carver. And the name pulled up several results, but she found him on the 3rd try. His profile was sparse, a few photos, minimal personal information. But one of the photos showed him with a young girl. Dark hair, serious eyes, smile that lit up her whole face. The daughter. Rosie, according to the photo caption. She looked happy, healthy, well cared for. Gideon looked different too. Older, obviously, but something else. More solid, more confident. The man in the photo bore little resemblance to the uncertain warehouse worker Leah had left. Leah clicked through to his business page. Clearwater Solutions, commercial water system, maintenance and consulting, multiple locations, dozens of employees, testimonials from major companies and institutions. He'd built something, while Leah had been chasing modeling contracts and Instagram followers, and Gideon had built an actual business, a life, a future. The realization felt like swallowing glass. Over the following weeks, Leah's situation deteriorated further. The storage unit company auctioned off her belongings. The landlord served eviction papers for 3 months' unpaid rent. The police detective called twice more about the warrant. The modeling agency that had been representing her dropped her from their roster via email with no explanation. Leah ended up back in her mother's house in the suburbs, the same house she'd sworn she'd never return to, the same bedroom with the same faded wallpaper from her teenage years. Her mother didn't say, "I told you so," which somehow made it worse. The pity was worse than judgment would have been. She got a job at a department store, cosmetics counter. The work was numbing and repetitive, but it paid enough to start addressing her debts. The customers treated her like she was invisible, which in a way was a relief. No pretending to be someone special, just showing up, demonstrating lipstick colors, and collecting a paycheck. One afternoon, a woman came to the counter who looked vaguely familiar. It took Leah several seconds to place her. Veronica Chen, the loan officer who'd been dating one of the photographers Leah had worked with years ago. They'd met at a gallery opening. Leah? Veronica's surprise was evident. "Hi, Veronica. It's been a while." Small talk followed. Awkward questions about what each of them had been up to. Veronica mentioned she was still at the credit union, now managing commercial loan portfolios. She'd gotten married, had a son, bought a house. "What about you?" Veronica asked, though her eyes had already assessed Leah's department store name tag and uniform. "I'm figuring things out," Leah said, the vague answer she'd perfected for these situations. Veronica nodded sympathetically. Then, as if reading Leah's mind, "I actually saw one of your old friends recently, Gideon Carver. I handled his business loan years ago. He's done incredibly well. Clearwater Solutions is one of our success stories." The name hit Leah like a physical blow. "Gideon? You two dated, right? I remember you mentioning him once. Anyway, he's speaking at a business development conference next month. The credit union is sponsoring it. Should be interesting. His whole story about building a company from nothing." After Veronica left, Leah stood at the cosmetics counter trying to process what she'd just learned. And Gideon was successful enough to speak at conferences. Successful enough to be someone's success story. The conference was open to the public. Leah checked the website that evening. $50 for general admission. A panel discussion about entrepreneurship and small business development, followed by a networking reception. She shouldn't go. What would be the point? To torture herself with evidence of how well Gideon had done without her. To face the man she'd called insignificant and see that he'd become anything but. But Leah bought a ticket anyway. Maybe out of curiosity, maybe out of masochism, maybe because some part of her needed to see, with her own eyes, what she'd walked away from. The conference took place at a downtown hotel with crystal chandeliers and marble floors. And Leah wore the nicest outfit she still owned. A navy dress she'd bought for an audition 3 years ago, paired with heels that made her feet hurt after 10 minutes. She felt out of place among the crowd of business owners and entrepreneurs, people who moved with the easy confidence of financial security. The panel discussion was held in a large conference room. Leah took a seat in the back, partially hidden behind a column. 4 speakers sat at a long table on the stage, 2 women and 2 men, all professionally dressed, all presumably successful in their respective fields. Gideon was the 3rd speaker. Leah almost didn't recognize him. He wore a tailored suit that actually fit, glasses she didn't remember him having, and carried himself with a self-assurance that the Gideon she'd known had never possessed. When he spoke, his voice was clear and steady. No trace of the uncertainty that used to underline his every statement. He told his story in broad strokes. Started a business 8 years ago with minimal capital. Built it through consistent service and specialized expertise. Expanded to multiple locations. Now employed nearly 30 people across 4 regional offices. Focused on commercial water system maintenance with emphasis on healthcare and food service sectors. He didn't mention being abandoned with a newborn, didn't mention sleeping in his truck or living in a basement, didn't mention the years of brutal work and constant uncertainty. The story he told was sanitized, focused on business strategy and market opportunity rather than personal desperation. But Leah knew the subtext. She'd been there for the beginning. Or rather, she'd been there and then deliberately left. While he was building this company, solving these problems, becoming this person on stage, she'd been chasing the ghost of a modeling career that never materialized. During the Q&A section, someone asked Gideon about work-life balance with a young child. "It's the whole reason I work," Gideon said simply. "My daughter is 8 now. Everything I build for her future." That's not just motivation. It's the underlying purpose. The business has to serve the life, not the other way around. Our daughter, Leah thought. The words were bitter in her mouth, even though she didn't say them aloud. The daughter she'd abandoned was now the motivation for all of Gideon's success. After the panel ended, the networking reception began in an adjacent ballroom. Leah told herself to leave. Just go home, and process what she'd seen, and move on with her life. But her feet carried her to the ballroom anyway, drawn by some combination of curiosity and self-destruction. The room was crowded with attendees, mingling around high-top tables and a bar serving wine and craft cocktails. Leah accepted a glass of white wine from a server and stood near the edge of the room, watching. Gideon was surrounded by people, business owners asking questions, admirers offering congratulations, networking opportunists trying to make connections. He handled it all with grace, shaking hands, exchanging business cards, laughing at appropriate moments. Then someone entered through the far door, and Gideon's face transformed. The professional mask dropped, replaced by genuine joy. He excused himself from the group around him and walked toward the entrance. Leah followed his gaze and felt her heart stop. A young girl, 8 years old, dark hair in braids, wearing a purple dress, ran across the ballroom and launched herself at Gideon. He caught her, lifting her up despite the formal setting, despite the professional crowd watching. "How was the speech, Daddy?" The girl's voice carried across the room. "You tell me. You watched from the back with Ruth, right?" "You did great. Way better than the boring lady before you." Gideon laughed and set her down. An older woman, Ruth, presumably, approached them with a warm smile. She said something to Gideon, gestured to the crowd, and then to the girl. Gideon nodded, his hand resting on his daughter's shoulder with unmistakable pride and affection. Leah's glass slipped from her hand. It didn't shatter, the carpet was too thick, but wine splashed across her shoes and the hem of her dress. Several people turned to look, including Gideon. Their eyes met across the crowded ballroom. For a moment, everything else fell away. The chatter, the music, the clinking glasses, just Gideon and Leah, staring at each other across 8 years and an ocean of divergent choices. Leah saw recognition dawn on his face, then something else. Not anger exactly, not even surprise. Just a kind of cool assessment, like he was looking at a stranger who happened to share a face with someone from his past. He said something to Ruth, who nodded and took the girl's hand. Then he walked toward Leah. Each step measured, unhurried. The confident walk of someone who had nothing to prove. Leah. Her name on his lips was neutral, a statement of fact, not an accusation. "Hi, Gideon." Her voice came out smaller than she intended. "Surprised to see you here. I heard you were speaking. I wanted to—" What? What had she wanted? "I wanted to see how you were doing." "I'm doing well, as you can probably tell." He gestured vaguely at the room, the conference, the evidence of his success. "You built something incredible." "I built what was necessary." The words hung between them. Leah searched his face for some trace of the man she'd left in that hospital hallway. The man who'd looked devastated and lost and completely overwhelmed. But that man was gone, replaced by this polished version who regarded her with the mild interest one might show an old acquaintance at a reunion. "Your daughter," Leah ventured. She's beautiful. Yes, she is. Gideon's expression didn't change, but something flickered behind his eyes. Rosie's the best thing that ever happened to me, despite how she arrived. The despite landed like a slap. Leah deserved it, she knew. Deserved worse, probably. Gideon, She stopped. What could she possibly say? Sorry seemed grotesquely insufficient. Any explanation would sound like an excuse. You what? Gideon's voice remained even. Not cruel, but not kind either. Just factual. I made mistakes, a lot of mistakes, and seeing you here, seeing what you've become, I just wanted you to know that I realize what I walked away from. You walked away from a 3-pound infant and a mountain of hospital debt. What I became happened after you left. Not because of you, not in spite of you. Just after. The words were carefully chosen, Leah realized. But he wasn't giving her credit for his success. That would have required acknowledging she'd mattered. He wasn't blaming her for his struggles. That would have given her too much power over his narrative. He was simply stating facts. How did you do it? Leah asked. Build all this while raising her alone? I wasn't alone. I had help from good people. People who saw someone struggling and chose to extend a hand. He paused. People unlike you. There it was, the judgment Leah had been expecting, but delivered so calmly it hurt worse than shouting would have. I know I was awful. I know I abandoned both of you when you needed me most. If I could go back, you can't go back. That's not how time works. Gideon glanced over his shoulder at Rosie, who was showing Ruth something on a phone. I used to think about this moment. I imagined running into you someday, showing you what you'd missed. I had whole speeches prepared. And now I realize it doesn't matter. You're not part of our story anymore. You're just a footnote in the difficult chapter at the beginning. Rosie doesn't ask about you. She has Ruth, who's more of a grandmother to her than any blood relative. She has a stable home, good school, friends who sleep over on weekends. She has everything she needs. Does she know about me? She knows her mother made a choice to leave. When she's older, if she wants more details, I'll provide them. But I won't poison her against you. That's not who I am. The grace in that statement made Leah want to cry. She'd expected, hoped for even, anger. Anger she could have handled. This calm indifference was devastating. Mr. Carver, a voice interrupted, or a woman in her 50s, professionally dressed, holding a business card. I'm Patricia Reynolds, administrator at County General. I'd love to discuss expanding your services to our facilities. Do you have a moment? Of course. Gideon turned to Leah. I need to get back to why I'm here. It was educational seeing you again. Educational. Not nice, not painful, not meaningful. Educational. He walked away without looking back, immediately engaging with Patricia about water system protocols and maintenance schedules. Professional, polished, completely in his element. The woman with the business card was clearly important, clearly wealthy, clearly someone who could advance Clearwater Solutions' interests. Leah stood alone near the wine-stained carpet and watched Gideon work the room. She saw him introduce Patricia to other people, a laugh at someone's joke, accept compliments on his presentation with humble gratitude. She saw him return to Rosie and Ruth, saw how naturally he transitioned between professional mode and father mode, how easy the whole thing seemed for him. This was what she'd called insignificant, this capable, successful, devoted father who'd built a thriving business and a stable life from absolute zero. Ruth noticed Leah watching. The older woman's eyes narrowed slightly, and she said something to Gideon. He glanced back at Leah once more, his expression unreadable, then said something to Ruth that made her nod and take Rosie's hand. They left through a side door. Gideon, Ruth, and Rosie, a family unit that had nothing to do with Leah and never would. Leah left shortly after, taking the subway back to her mother's house in the suburbs. The train was nearly empty. Her reflection in the dark window showed a woman in a wine-stained dress, mascara smudged from the tears she'd finally allowed herself to cry. She'd thought seeing Gideon would provide closure, answers, maybe even an opportunity for redemption. Instead, she'd gotten the truth she'd been avoiding for 8 years. She'd made choices that couldn't be unmade, had abandoned people who deserved better, had chased a future that never existed while destroying the one that did. Gideon had moved on, built a life that was full and successful and entirely separate from her. He didn't need her apology, didn't need her regret, didn't need her acknowledgement of his success. He'd achieved all of it without her, and would continue achieving without her. The most painful part wasn't that he hated her, and it was that he'd stopped caring enough to hate her. 3 months after the conference, Leah received a letter forwarded from her old apartment. The envelope was simple, unbranded, with a return address for Clearwater Solutions. Inside was a check for $10,000 and a brief note in handwriting she recognized as Gideon's. "This covers half of the NICU bill I paid 8 years ago. Consider your financial obligation to your daughter fulfilled. You don't owe us anything now. Please don't contact us again." The check was signed by Gideon Carver, with Clearwater Solutions, LLC, printed beneath his name. Leah stared at the check for a long time. $10,000 would change her life, pay off the debts crushing her, give her a fresh start, let her rebuild. But accepting it would mean accepting the finality, the absolute end of any connection to Gideon and Rosie. It would mean she'd been bought out of their lives, reduced to a transaction that could be closed with a check. Still, what choice did she have? Pride was a luxury she couldn't afford. She deposited the check the next day, used it to pay off her debts, move into a small apartment, and enroll in community college courses for dental hygiene. A practical career her mother had suggested, one with steady employment and health benefits. Life continued. Not the life she'd imagined at 24, but a life nonetheless. She worked at the department store during the day, attended classes at night, and slowly rebuilt a version of stability that looked nothing like her old dreams. Sometimes, late at night, she looked at Clearwater Solutions' website and read about the company's expansion into new markets, saw photos of Gideon at various business events, never saw pictures of Rosie. He kept his daughter's life private, protected from the public presence his professional success required. Leah wondered if Rosie would ever search for her, if she'd want answers about the mother who'd left, if there would ever be a moment of reckoning, explanation, or reconciliation. But mostly, Leah tried not to think about it at all. The past was past. The choices were made. All she could do was move forward with the reduced expectations and humbled understanding that she'd had everything and thrown it away for the mirage of something better. Meanwhile, Gideon's life continued its upward trajectory. Clearwater Solutions opened 2 more regional offices. The business was featured in trade publications as an example of successful niche market domination. Gideon was invited to speak at more conferences, serve on industry advisory boards, and mentor other entrepreneurs through the same credit union program that had given him his first loan. Ruth continued being the grandmother figure Rosie needed, though she was slowing down. Gideon hired her a part-time assistant to help with her own home maintenance, insisting it was just fair compensation for everything she'd done for him. Ruth accepted with her usual grace. Rosie thrived. She excelled at school, played soccer, and showed an interest in science that made Gideon quietly proud. She asked about her mother exactly once, when she was 9, and learned in school about different family structures. Why did she leave? Rosie had asked one evening while Gideon was making dinner. Gideon had thought carefully about his answer. Sometimes people aren't ready to be parents. She made a choice that she thought was best at the time. It hurt, but it also meant you and I got to build this life together. Just us. Are you mad at her? I used to be. Now I'm just grateful for what we have. Rosie had accepted this answer with the straightforward logic of childhood and never brought it up again. She had what she needed. A father who was present, a home that was stable, a life that was full. The business Gideon built wasn't just about money or success. It was about proving to himself, to Leah, to the universe that had tried to crush him, that worthlessness was a lie, that the person Leah had called insignificant could build something significant, that the man she'd abandoned in a hospital hallway could become someone who commanded respect in boardrooms and conference halls. But more than anything, it was about giving Rosie the childhood he'd never had, the security, the opportunities, the knowledge that her father would always show up, always provide, always be there. That was the real victory, not the money in the bank, or the employees on payroll, or the recognition in industry circles. The victory was Rosie's laughter, her confidence, her certainty that she was loved and valued and important. Everything else was just infrastructure supporting that single, essential truth. On Rosie's 10th birthday, Gideon threw her a party at their house. 20 kids from school, a rented bounce house in the backyard, a cake shaped like a soccer ball because she'd just made the travel team. Ruth helped organize everything, and Troy from Clearwater Solutions came by with his own kids, who were similar ages. Gideon stood on the back porch, watching the chaos. Children screaming with joy, parents chatting over drinks, Rosie in the center of it all wearing a crown that said "Birthday Girl" in glittery letters. 10 years ago, he'd been holding a 3-pound infant in a hospital room, feeling like the world had ended. But the world hadn't ended. It had just transformed into something different than he'd planned. Better even, in ways he couldn't have imagined during those dark months. Ruth appeared beside him, handing him a beer. "You did good, Gideon. We did good." "Fair enough." Ruth clinked her bottle against his. "Here's to the next 10 years. "The next 10 years," Gideon echoed. And watching his daughter, their daughter, really, since Ruth had been more present than any biological grandparent, Gideon felt something he'd rarely allowed himself to feel. Contentment. Not happiness exactly. Happiness was too fragile, too dependent on circumstances. But contentment. The solid satisfaction of a life built through determination and grace, setbacks and victories, loneliness and community. He'd started with nothing, built something meaningful, raised a child who was healthy and happy and whole. That was enough. More than enough. It was everything. If Gideon's journey moved you, like this video and subscribe for more stories of justice. Tell us your thoughts on Leah's regret in the comments below.